Hello, everybody. Welcome into Sports by GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Jeremy Lapidus. Today, we have a big show. We're going to do an NBA mock draft, just the top 10 picks as the NBA draft takes place tomorrow night. We had a new champion crowned in the NHL. The Stanley Cup is lifted by the Florida Panthers, the first time in their history that they have ever lifted the Stanley Cup. We'll talk about that game. We'll talk about Connor McDavid winning the Conn Smythe trophy, just the sixth time ever that a player in the NHL has won the Conn Smythe without being on the Stanley Cup winning team. We'll talk about whether or not that was a good decision and how it kind of feels watching that ceremony at the end. Then we'll move into the world of football to end off our show, talk a little bit about the Dallas Cowboys. They had an interesting offseason. We'll talk about all their moves, give them a little letter grade, see how they did this offseason, and we'll close off our show talking about their schedule for next season, give a little prediction of how they're going to do in the 2024-2025 NFL season. But like I was saying, we are going to start off our show today here going over a little bit of the NBA draft. I did a top 10 picks mock draft, so just the lottery picks here. We're going to talk about those, but before we get into that, remember that if you would like to be an even bigger part of the show than you already are, all you need to do is go to gsmcpodcast.net. Leave a tip or donation with a message in it. That message should pop up on the bottom of the screen for you, me, and everybody else around the world to see. If you do have a burning question about sports, anything at all that you would like to add, go ahead and throw that in the comments. I'll get to it as soon as I possibly can. Appreciate all of you guys for sticking around, talking some sports with me here on a beautiful Tuesday afternoon. But like I was saying, we are going to start off our show here today in the NBA. We're going to do a little bit of an NBA mock draft. I've got my first 10 picks mocked out here. We talked a little bit in our last episode about what the Hawks might do with that number one overall pick, if they're going to draft, if they're going to trade. And there's been a lot of changes in the last couple days. Originally, it seemed like Zachary Rissechar from France was going to be that number one overall pick. I've seen Alex Sarr go first in a lot of different mocks. I have Alex Sarr going to the Hawks there. We talked a lot about how the Hawks just a couple years ago were in the Eastern Conference Finals, and the real piece that they're missing, aside from injuries being a factor, they still have Trae Young, they still have DeJounte Murray. That backcourt is fine. What they're missing is presence down low that they can use to, spread the floor, become a more effective team as far as, having that presence down low, as Clint Capella has not been able to get the job done in recent years. So I have them taking Alex Sarr here, big man who has the ability to shoot. He has struggled a little bit from three, shooting under 30% for the season over there overseas, but his size and his ability to finish down low is going to be huge for a Hawks team that, if they can continue to build around Trae Young, I still believe can make a big leap in an East that, as we saw this season, is incredibly weak. And there's a lot of teams that have that ability to make this jump, right? Especially having that number one overall pick, being a team that was so close to making the playoffs last season. The Hawks are a team that absolutely probably have the best chance of making that big jump that we see a lot of teams make. At least one team we usually see make a big jump in the offseason. The Hawks are a team that can absolutely do that if they get this pick to hit at number one overall. I have them taking Alex Sarr here. At number two, that leaves the Wizards in an interesting position, right? The Wizards are a team kind of left motionless, right? They don't really seem to have a set path that they're going down. They've got Jordan Poole, they've got Kyle Kuzma. It's not really the guys that you want to build a serious contender around. They're nice pieces to have, right? But this Wizards team isn't winning anything this year. So I have them taking Zachary Rissechar out of France, giving them a piece that they can develop a 3-and-D wing, stretch the floor. He has the ability to develop more. And if the Wizards can develop him, he can be a great player, someone that they can build around as they have a little bit of young talent there. There's always this question of, what do you want to do? Do you want to win now or not? And a lot of these guys, especially in this draft, are more project players. So we'll see what happens in a little bit in this draft. But uh, I have Risa Share going to the Wizards at 2. At been a lot of chatter here, right? They might trade out of it. I did this mock without any trades from where it is. I do think there will be some trades in this in this draft, maybe even up into the top 10. But the Rockets here, I have them taking Reed Shepherd. Reed Shepherd is that, quintessential shooter. He shot 52% from 3 in at Kentucky this season. That is an insane number. That's a number that might, if it's sustainable, he might be the next Steph Curry as far as shooting goes, right? And adding him to a Rockets team that seems like they want to win now, adding a shooter like that whose talent can, as long as he gets an open shot, you assume it'll translate. That'll put them in position to win now. They've been in talks to get some of these big stars, most recently Paul George, which is a whole nother conversation. Not something I think they should do. I don't think they're at that step yet, but Reed Shepherd there at 3 seems like the pick that the Rockets are going to take. And if not, I maybe Stephen Castle, a tall defensive guard, can also shoot from UConn there. Another guy that they might take. But at 4, here comes the Spurs. And if the Spurs can get Reed Shepherd, I think that's a dream draft for them. They do have 2 picks in that top 10, but I have them taking Stephen Castle here. After Reed Shepherd goes to the Rockets, I have the Spurs taking Castle. Again, that size pairing him with Wemby, 2 7-footers, him being able to play guard on the outside, run that pick and roll, shoot, and play great defense. Defense is something that, while Wemby was great at the interior defense, they really struggled on the exterior guarding these guys. So having someone that can come in and be a force on defense immediately in Castle is something that I think the Spurs really do want. At 5 here, I've got the Pistons taking Klingon, his teammate Donovan Klingon out of UConn. They go 4-5 here. The Pistons kind of just need best available. And you could make the argument for Dalton Knecht there. You could make the argument for Rob Dillingham if they wanted a guard. But, you have some guards there that you're trying to develop. Getting a big guy in Klingon is someone that I think could really benefit the future of this Pistons team. At 6, I've got Dalton Knecht going to the Hornets. He's the best shooter, best scorer available, and the Hornets just need something to get going. LaMelo Ball, when he's on the court, has a little bit of that excitement, but he hasn't been able to stay on the court. So you need a punch to go with him, and maybe a 1-2 punch there. I have him going at 6 to the Hornets. At number 7, Matthias Buzelis to the Trailblazers. Again, I think a lot of these teams, especially a team like the Trailblazers, they've got a lot of time to develop someone. You could see them go and get more of a project player like a Nikola Topic or someone else there. But I have them taking Buzelis here. He's a little more polished, and again, they're still developing some of their stars. They've got a long way to go. They're not expecting to win this season, but I have them taking him at 7. At 8, the Spurs just got Stephen Castle. So now they need to go get, someone, a more prototypical guard that can help run that pick and roll. I have him taking Rob Dillingham here at 8. They missed out on his Kentucky teammate Reed Shepherd at 4, and he can get, someone that can run that pick and roll effectively, be an explosive scorer at 8. Again, they're trying to build this team around Wemby. Being able to spread the floor, being able to shoot, being able to get the ball moving is something that's very important for this Spurs team as they continue to move forward. At 9, I have the Grizzlies taking Nikola Topic. This is a little more of a project pick. He's a guy that might need a year or two to develop, but I think he might turn into a steal in this draft. He's got all those all the tools that you want to look at for a top draft pick here. And the Grizzlies, I know they've got Ja Morant. They kind of want to compete, but adding Topic here, I think, is the right pick. And rounding out the top 10, I have the Jazz taking Devin Carter. Devin Carter out of Providence. He's going to be able to, again, get that shot going for them. The Jazz need a lot. All these teams in the top 10 need a lot, and I think this is a spot 9 and 10 where you might see trades happen. I don't know if the Jazz have a guy that they're in love with here at 10, but Devin Carter is a guy that's up there on my board. He's not a must get, but he's someone that we might see go in the top 10. So those are my top 10s here. I've got Sar 1, Risa Share 2, Castle 3, Shepard 4, Klingon 5, Connect 6, Buzelis 7, Dillingham 8, Topic 9, and Carter 10. Let me know who you have in the top 10 of this draft. The draft takes place tomorrow night. We'll see what happens. I think this is going to be kind of an interesting one because there's not anybody that people have a consensus must have in that top 10. So I think we might see a lot of trades, a lot of chaos going on in that top 10. So I'm excited to see what happens. But in our next segment, we are going to move into the world of hockey as the Stanley Cup has finally been won. The Florida Panthers take home their first ever Stanley Cup as they take down the Oilers 2-1 in a decisive Game 7. We'll talk all about that game, how it went, and what it looked like as the Panthers were celebrating their Stanley Cup victory. So stick around for that. We'll be right back here on Sports by GSMC Podcast Network. Feel like I'm losing my mind. It's everybody in the world. Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. It's everybody in the world. Please, Lord, give me a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. Look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up in the basement. Statement. The top is so vacant. I'm in this shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that sound. Get in my way and to be put down. Hitting your place, I'll get my sound. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the losing fits, I'm losing shit. It's stupid if you choose to live, but choose to dip. You choose to fight, and lose your grip and lose your gift. Oh. Feel like I'm losing my mind. It's everybody in the world. Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. It's everybody in the world. Welcome back to Sports by GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Jeremy Lapidus. If you are just tuning in, we just finished going over the top 10 NBA mock draft that takes place tomorrow night. We will see the Hawks with the number 1 overall pick. If they keep it, if they trade out, I have them taking Alex Sarr at number 1 overall. In this segment, though, we are going to move out of the NBA for the day, talk a little bit about the NHL, the Stanley Cup. We finally have a champion crowned in the National Hockey League as the Florida Panthers stave off the reverse sweep that was almost thrust upon them by the Edmonton Oilers, winning 2-1 last night in a thrilling game, a crazy third period down the stretch, especially with some great defensive plays, great goaltending, and an interesting choice for Conn Smythe. So we'll talk about all of that in these next 2 segments. But before we get into that, remember that if you would like to be an even bigger part of the show than you already are, all you need to do is go to gsmcpodcast.net. Leave a tip or donation with a message in it. That message should pop up on the bottom of the screen for you, me, and everybody else around the world to see. If you do have a burning question about sports, anything at all that you would like to ask, go ahead and throw that in the comments. I'll get to it as soon as I possibly can. I appreciate all of you guys for sticking around, talking some sports with me here on a beautiful Tuesday afternoon. But like I was saying, we are going to get into the world of hockey here with the Panthers winning their first ever Stanley Cup. The Panthers have played a lot of hockey. I just want to start off with that. They've made it to the Stanley Cup 2 years in a row. They finally get their first one after losing in 5 last year to the Vegas Golden Knights. This game 7 was the way that the Panthers know they could play. This is the way that we expected the Panthers to play this series the whole way through, right? Even in the games they were winning, even in the games 1, 2, and 3 that they were winning, they weren't playing like this the whole time. You talk about domination defensively. Outside of that third period, when the Oilers really started to get desperate, the defensive and even then the defense was incredible for the Florida Panthers. They were able to make stops on wide open nets. It was a great defensive game plan, and whatever they did in game 6 and 7 against Connor McDavid to shut him down, it worked to perfection. He had a total of 2 shots in those last 2 games, 0 points, 0 goals, no offense coming from the best player in the world in the last 2 games after he scored 4 points 2 games in a row to put them in that situation for game 6 and game 7. The Panthers played great. We saw exactly why they made it to the finals, right? We saw exactly why they were up 3-0 in the finals. Sergei Bobrovsky had a great game. That defense, that elite defense, that best defense in the league showed up. They were able to shut down this best offense in the league. They scored opportune goals, these dirty opportune goals, and they were able to just not make mistakes. What was really killing them in the 3 games that they lost leading up to game 7 was the fact that they just kept making mistakes. They kept turning the puck over. They kept giving the Oilers breakaways. And even in the one breakaway that they gave away tonight or last night against the Oilers, they were able to cash it in, right? The Oilers were 5 for 5 on breakaways in their last couple games, right? They were able to figure out the power play for the Oilers. They were able to shut them down. They didn't let a single power play goal in. That defense, like I said, that energetic defense, they were able to play fast, play physical, and play within themselves. They always are fast, physical, and aggressive, but what I think really was getting to them in games 4, 5, and 6, and what really killed them is they were getting over aggressive. And that's not to say that they weren't over aggressive last night. Again, that's their play style. Their play style is, I'm going to get you. What are you going to do about it? But they were, playing within themselves instead of trying to, kill the other team, right? And that's what really did it. They got back in the locker room after the game. They said this was the least nervous they'd been all series long, which is a little hard to believe. All the pressure is on you. You're about to be possibly enshrined in history as just the second team ever to get reverse swept in the Stanley Cup Finals, first one in 80 years. All of Canada is rooting against you. You have no cup in Canada for 32 years now. That's continues to grow. There's a lot of there's a lot of storylines here, right? And they were able to put it all aside, play their game, which is something they had just gotten away from in recent games, and that's why they were struggling, right? Sergei Bobrovsky came back and played vintage Sergei Bobrovsky like we saw him. There's a question. He didn't end up winning that Conn Smythe trophy. It ended up going to Connor McDavid, and we'll talk all about that actually in our next segment, because that's a really interesting story here. But Sergei Bobrovsky, outside of those 3 games where he gave up, 5, 6 goals each game, right? He played incredible this entire postseason, and I want to give him his flowers, and I'll give him more flowers. We'll talk about the comparison there between him and Connor McDavid and the Conn Smythe in the next segment, but he played vintage game. He played like he did in the first couple games of the series where he was a brick wall, where no matter how good the Oilers were playing, he wasn't letting anything through. And a lot of that, it's not just on him, especially in that third period. There were 3 or 4 scrums around the net. There was one where he was on his back. There was one where he was completely on the other side of the net. And the defensemen and the sticks of the Florida Panthers were able to stop these wide open shots from going into the net. They were stopping the shots. They were taking it, blocking those shots with their bodies, just not letting anything get to the net. And that's the kind of swarming defense that they were playing. There's no really other way to describe it the way it was. There were 3 or 4 occasions in the last 10 minutes of the game where the Oilers, and where there were 9 of the 10 players on the ice were all inside of the crease, right? There was just a big scrum there, and Bobrovsky was strong enough to hold off the puck. The Panthers defense did a great job not letting anything get through. It was just a great team performance all around. Connor Verhaeghe, Mr. Clutch, scores a goal, has an assist. Sam Reinhart scores the game-winning goal on a tough angle shot off in the second period. And then that defense, like I said, that defense shines. That's what they've been known for. That's what they relied on, getting all the way to the cup and ending up lifting the cup there. It was just a great team game by the Panthers, and they absolutely deserved it. This is their first ever Stanley Cup win. They had only won one game in the Stanley Cup final ever before this series. That was last season against the Vegas Golden Knights. They've been a franchise for 30 years. Bringing a cup down to Florida means a couple things, right? The NHL continues to expand, and I think we're seeing that a lot, especially with it being back on ESPN and being that publicized. When it was on NBC, there just weren't enough eyes on the game. Getting a warm weather city to win a Stanley Cup, I think it's hard to underestimate how much that's going to mean, right? Hockey is king up in Canada, right? It's cold, you can play all the time. Hockey is king up in Minnesota. Up in the Northeast, there's a lot of great hockey cities, a lot of great hockey fans. It's been a tradition for a long time. It gets cold, you can play, right? But down in the South, it's warm. It's hard to get these ice rinks. Getting a cup down there, that's what they were trying to establish down in Arizona. It didn't end up working. They moved to Utah. Getting a cup down in Florida, especially after the success of the Tampa Bay Lightning just a couple seasons ago, is huge for the continued expansion of the NHL as it continues to grow. I think I haven't looked at the numbers, but I bet you this was the most watched Stanley Cup final in history. The amount of publicity, that it was getting was huge. Connor McDavid being on that tear, almost having a reverse sweep. It was so many great storylines in it, but the Panthers end up raising the cup. We saw potentially the final nail in the Sergei Bobrovsky Hall of Fame case go in last night as he lifted the cup. He was handed it second. For those who don't know, there's a tradition. The captain gets the cup first from the commissioner, and then they go and they hand it off. And it's kind of like a respect thing of who gets handed the cup. It's like an order. Sergei Bobrovsky got it second. That's the biggest amount of respect you can get, because captain always gets it first. So it's deserving. It's really cool to see that ceremony, and that's why I love the Stanley Cup playoffs, right? Not only is it the most intense playoffs, right? There's so much action nonstop, so physical, but there's all these traditions. The Stanley Cup, Lord Stanley is the greatest trophy in all of sports. No one else has every single name etched on it that's ever won. No one else has the mystique and lore around it. You get to spend a whole day with it, do whatever you want. There's so many stories around that cup. It's got its own body. It's got two bodyguards, for God's sake, that just their job is to travel around with the cup. There's no other trophy in sports that is like that, and it's special to see. We love the ceremonies over there. Alexander Barkov gets his, first cup. All these Florida Panthers that have been with the team forever finally get that moment. I don't think they'll be back. This felt like a last hurrah, and I know that's kind of weird to say, coming off of a cup win, but this felt like a last hurrah for them. This is a team that's old. There's a lot of players retiring. This is a team that, I don't think they're just going to fall off a cliff, right? I think they'll still be playoff team next year. I think they'll still be a top 3 seed in their division, and I think they probably will win a playoff series. But playing this much hockey, finally getting it, they can kind of finally let that sigh of relief out, relax, and they got one, right? They finally got one. They finally got over the hump of the Lightning that had been bothering them for all these years. They finally got into the cup, and then they lose, and then they make it back just the next season, and they are able to finish what they started. So it's a great run by the Florida Panthers. It does feel like they're done. They might be back, but we'll see. But one more thing to talk about in the cup, and we will in the Stanley Cup. We'll talk all about it here in the next segment. Or actually, before we do, the one thing with the Oilers, though, actually, I totally forgot to mention this, is their line changes. And this is one of the things that I didn't quite understand when I was watching this game, especially in that third period. If you look, when they pulled the goalie with about a minute left, which they pulled their goalie way too late, Stuart Skinner was on the ice for way too long trying to get that Oilers team back even, get it to overtime. He was on that ice for way too long, but you saw it. They had their guys. They had McDavid. They had Draisaitl. They had Hyman. They had Bouchard. They had all these guys out for way too long. And when they finally had to go on that last all-out attack, they had nothing left. They couldn't get the puck into the zone. It was trapped in the corner for the last 10 seconds. They couldn't dig it out. And that's on the coaching staff, really. They mismanaged that entire third period. And I know it's a lot on their bodies, a lot on the wear and tear of the Edmonton Oilers, but you have to be a little smarter than that. You have to let some of your fourth line depth that have been providing all of this option, doesn't have to be the fourth line, but your depth that's been providing all of this offense for the last two games. The top line didn't get anything in the first two games in the last two games of this series, right? McDavid, no offense. Draisaitl had an assist, but no offense, right? Whatever the Panthers were doing, they were zeroing in on McDavid and not letting him get anything in those last two games. But the depth was coming through. Fogle was coming through. Janmark scored the only goal. He was coming through. This was a team that had the depth. They just weren't relying on it. And I think that was the downfall more than anything. Also, with how great the Panthers played, I don't think it would have mattered. But that stings because you think that if they had, let their number one sit one extra shift instead of having them out there for 5 of the last 7 minutes, maybe they could have made a push, sent it to overtime. But anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about Connor McDavid here in the next segment. We'll talk all about how he won the Conn Smythe, if that was the right decision, how the voting works, which is super dumb, actually. But we'll talk all about that and more coming up next here on Sports by GSMC Podcast Network.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube. Absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube, absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube.
Welcome back to Sports by GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Jeremy Lapidus. If you were just tuning in, we just finished talking all about how the Florida Panthers lifted their first ever Stanley Cup in their franchise history, winning 2-1 in a do-or-die Game 7 against the Edmonton Oilers that were red hot, forcing a Game 7 after being down 3-0 in that series. We'll talk a little bit more about that in this segment, with the Conn Smythe Trophy being given to Connor McDavid, captain of the losing team, the Edmonton Oilers. We'll talk about how that kind of went, whether or not he deserved it. But we also talked about the NBA in the first segment. We talked about the top 10 mock draft. Alex Sarr, I have going number 1 overall to the Hawks as the NBA draft takes place tomorrow night. We will talk, like I said, about the Conn Smythe Trophy in this segment, whether or not Connor McDavid deserved it, and much more about the Stanley Cup. But before we get into that, remember that if you would like to be an even bigger part of the show than you already are, all you need to do is go to gsmcpodcast.net. Leave a tip or donation with a message in it. That message should pop up on the bottom of the screen for you, me, and everybody else around the world to see. If you do have a burning question about sports, anything at all that you would like to ask, go ahead and throw that in the comments. I'll get to it as soon as I possibly can. I appreciate all of you guys for sticking around, talking some sports with me here on a beautiful Tuesday afternoon. But like I was saying, we are going to finish up our Stanley Cup talk today here, finish up our Stanley Cup conversation for the season, talking about Connor McDavid and the Conn Smythe Trophy. For those who are unaware, the Conn Smythe Trophy goes to the MVP of the whole playoff. So it doesn't work like the NBA, where it's the finals MVP. In that case, I have no problem with it going to McDavid. He was definitely the finals MVP. Or actually, you know what? You could even make the argument that he wasn't there. But this goes to the playoff MVP, right? So this is for all 4 rounds of the playoffs, starting round, second round, third round, Stanley Cup final, right? And this is where I have a little bit of an issue because Connor McDavid absolutely deserved the award, right? There's no doubt in my mind that Connor McDavid, what he did in these playoffs, deserved an award. He broke a Wayne Gretzky record. He broke the Wayne Gretzky record for assists. He had 2 straight 4-point games in the Stanley Cup Finals to help propel the Edmonton Oilers to a Game 7 after falling behind 3-0. That is not a normal thing. He pushed this team to its absolute limit. He is the leader in that locker room, and he's the best player on earth. He absolutely deserved to win the Conn Smythe. Despite all of that, it felt wrong. If you were watching that game, I was watching that game at the end. They bring out the Conn Smythe trophy. Commissioner Gary Bettman is sitting there. He says, "Hey, I'm here to present the Conn Smythe trophy." The confetti is falling. The Panthers are celebrating. McDavid and the Oilers have left the ice and gone to the locker room. And he says, the winner is Connor McDavid. There's no cheers. Just, it's silent. You have some shocked looks in the crowd. I was kind of shocked sitting on my couch because, heading into that moment, right? Heading into the beginning of the third period, at the second intermission, they were talking about it on TV, and I was thinking, it's got to be Connor McDavid. You can't give it to Sergei Bobrovsky. He has a .902 save percentage. That'd be the lowest for any goalie to ever win it, right? And you can't really give it to anyone else because no one has really stood out on the Panthers. You could maybe argue Barkov, but I would give it to McDavid over Barkov any day. But then you have to think about how these teams got here, right? They were carried by Bobrovsky. It was Bobrovsky or McDavid. That's really what this came down to at the end. And then we were talking about it on TV. They said the voters have to make a vote in a 1-goal game with 10 minutes left in the third period. And with 10 minutes left in the third period, you can't make that judgment. I'm sorry. That's just wrong. They should have 5 minutes after the game when they're doing the whole cup ceremony to vote on who deserves it. Because I think those last 10 minutes really showed a lot. It showed how much the Panthers relied on Sergei Bobrovsky. He made 3 series of saves that probably, in all honesty, would have gone in against any other goalie, right? He made those saves and he kept them in it, and he deserved to win it. He really did. He would have gotten my vote, if only because it was so awkward, right? You go out, you just lose the cup. This is not a good night for you. And then you go and you get the award. And right, it's an honor. They were asking McDavid about it after the game, and McDavid just kind of looked around, he shrugged his shoulders, and he said, it's an honor, right? There's nothing else you can say, right? It's an honor, right? There's so many great names on the cup there. There's so many great names that deserve, and there's so many great names on the Conn Smythe, and he absolutely deserves to be up there with them. And his performance in the playoffs, I'm not going to argue. He absolutely deserved it. But it just feels wrong. It's one of those things where you are voting and you can't give the playoff MVP to a losing team. And I know every once in a while there's a special situation. But Connor McDavid, as good as he played in that playoffs, and as much as impressive as it is that he broke a Wayne Gretzky record, it just doesn't feel right not to give it to a Florida Panther. This is a Florida Panther team that was the best team in hockey, right? They deserve to win this cup. They outplayed, out-physicaled, and out-goalied everybody in the league. They just were straight up better. And in the end, they give it to Connor McDavid, and maybe that's for publicity. That's a little bit of a conspiracy theory there, right? You want your best player in the league, the face of your league, to get more awards regardless of the win, especially with how big of a series this has been for the NHL. But at the same time, it just, you could feel the silence, right? They weren't sure if Connor McDavid was going to come back out and accept that award, right? That's an award that you go shake the commissioner's hand, take the trophy, and go celebrate with your team. You were the best player. You were the best player on the cup-winning team, right? And I know that's not always how it goes. That's why it went to McDavid. McDavid definitely deserved it. Again, I want to stress that. But it just felt wrong. My vote heading into the game, heading into the third period, would have been McDavid. But once that horn sounded, once we knew that the Oilers lost, it just feels wrong to present it to a losing team. It's like a consolation prize. It's like a participation trophy. And I know it's not a consolation prize or a participation trophy, but It just feels like it is. It feels like we're saying, "Oh, McDavid, you did so good. It's not your fault you lost. Here, let's give you the Conn Smythe." Right? That's not how it should go. That's not how it should feel. That should be a celebratory moment, just like lifting the cup. You get to celebrate with your team. You should be able to celebrate with that Conn Smythe trophy, be recognized as the best player on your team that wins it. And that's just kind of the philosophy. In general, this won't be a thing. This has only happened 6 times ever, and it probably won't happen. The last time this happened was the 70s, 79, I believe, right? Or no, this happened in 2003 with the Ducks goalie, right? And he went out and he got it, and he was just not happy. You could see it, and obviously McDavid is not happy losing in Game 7 at that point. It's just not a good feeling, and it makes the trophy feel hollow. And I know 5 years from now we're going to look back at this and say, "Hey, that was the right decision." Right? Because if it had gone to Bobrovsky, people would look at it and be like, "Oh, he's the worst goalie to ever win the Conn Smythe," because by the numbers he is. But you can't tell everything by the numbers, right? And this is a legendary run by McDavid. He deserved it once again. But it feels wrong in the heat of the moment, giving it to the team that is lost in a Game 7. The entire opposing team is celebrating on the other side of the ice. And I know he didn't go out to get it, and I think that was the right move by him, definitely. But if he had gone out to get it, he just has to stare down the confetti rain as the team that just beat you, crushed your dreams, is celebrating on the other end of the ice. Let me know what you thought. Again, he deserved it. It feels wrong, right? Uh, we're going to move out of the world of hockey, close out our show talking about the Dallas Cowboys. We're going to talk about their offseason, give them a letter grade, and then we're going to do a schedule review. We're going to go through all 17 games that they play, go over matchups, tell you which games they're going to win, which games the Cowboys are going to lose, and see what their record will be at the end of the 2024-2025 season. So stick around for all of that. We'll be right back here on Sports by GSMC Podcast Network.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Hello, welcome back to Sports by GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Jeremy Lapidus. If you are just tuning in, we've talked a lot of hockey. We talked some NBA basketball. The NBA draft, is tomorrow night. We did a top 10 mock. I had Alex Sarr going number 1 overall to the Atlanta Hawks. Then we talked a lot about the Stanley Cup. The Florida Panthers bring home their first ever Stanley Cup in Game 7, winning 2-1. A great game by Bobrovsky, by the defense. An interesting coaching moves by the Oilers with their line switches at the end. And then we talked about the Conn Smythe trophy as Connor McDavid, captain of the Oilers, the losing team, ends up taking it home. He definitely deserved it for the stats he puts up. But if you were watching it at the end of the game, it just kind of felt like a gut punch to them to give it to him after they just lost the Stanley Cup. So it felt a little weird, but he absolutely deserved it. In this segment and next segment, we're going to move into the NFL. We're going to do a deep dive on the Dallas Cowboys offseason and their upcoming 2024 schedule. We're going to start in the offseason, talk about what they lost, what they gained, whether or not it was a good offseason, give them a letter grade. But before we get into that, remember that if you would like to be an even bigger part of the show than you already are, all you need to do is go to gsmcpodcast.net. Leave a tip or donation with a message in it. That message should pop up on the bottom of the screen for you, me, and everybody else around the world to see. If you do have a burning question about sports, anything at all that you would like to ask, go ahead and throw that in the comments, in the chat. I will get to it as soon as I possibly can. I appreciate all of you guys for sticking around, talking some sports with me here on a beautiful Tuesday afternoon. But like I was saying, we are going to get into the NFL here. We're going to start our series on the NFL offseason, on the NFL upcoming season, as we are just under 2 months away, just under 3 months away, excuse me, from kickoff on Thursday Night Football for the first week of the NFL season. So we're going to talk about the Dallas Cowboys offseason. We're going to go team by team. We're going to do each offseason. We're going to do each record prediction. We're starting off in the NFC East with America's team, the Dallas Cowboys. The Dallas Cowboys had an interesting offseason, right? There were a lot of comments about how they were supposed to have this big offseason, go all in, according to Jerry Jones. It was much more of a quiet offseason. You can argue that they got worse. Overall, their losses. They lost Tyron Smith, Tony Pollard. They lost Tyler Bidaz, Dante Fowler, Noah Igbenogany, and Jonathan Hankins. Not all of these are at the same level. They lost a couple other pieces, Dorrance Armstrong, but the big losses here for them are Tyron Smith, Tony Pollard, and Tyler Bidaz, right? This is an offensive line. This is a Cowboys team that's really been built along their offensive line, right? They lose those guys, especially Smith, who goes to the Jets. He's an all-pro level guy if he can stay on the field. Bidaz is, again, a really solid center. He goes to the Commanders, a division rival, really helping to shore up their interior offensive line. But Tyron Smith and Tyler Bidaz, both of them are going to be huge losses, especially also losing your running back, right? You go out and get Royce Freeman. He's the big running back pickup that they get. They bring in Ezekiel Elliott as well to probably be that workhorse back. I don't know if Zeke has that in him anymore. They lose Tony Pollard to the Titans, which after what Tony Pollard did, it's not entirely misunderstandable for them to let him walk, but you kind of have to have a replacement for him. Dak is under contract, and while he had a great season last year, losing two starting offensive linemen is going to hurt. I know in the draft they went out and they got Tyler Guyton, who should be a huge help for them, helping to replace a guy like Tyron Smith, but it's still going to be a downgrade. It's hard to replace and just come in at that 29th overall pick and get an all-pro level guy. It's not something that you can just plug and play at tackle, and there were a lot of great tackles in this draft, but you expected them to do more, especially in that offseason with the free agency tracker, right? You get a little healthier at cornerback. You get Trayvon Diggs back. You bring back Jordan Lewis. You sign Eric Kendricks to shore up that linebacker core. But outside of that, they didn't really do much, right? This has been a very quiet offseason for the Dallas Cowboys, a team that they won division last year. They lost in embarrassing fashion in the first round of the NFL playoffs to the Packers, a team that they fully expected to beat. Jordan Love really had his coming out party there for a lot of people in that game, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. I know they're kind of tied up with their own guys. They're working on extending CeeDee Lamb. They're working on extending Dak Prescott. They're working on extending Micah Parsons, right? These are guys that are super important to extend, and the way that they're set up against the cap right now, it's hard to go and get those marquee free agents, but it feels like they still should have been a little bit more active, at least in the running back market, right? And I know running backs are kind of starting to be less important, but you still have a coach in McCarthy who loves to have that old school football, loves to have that back to run the ball with, and Dak had a MVP caliber year last season. We don't know if he's going to be able to put those numbers up again. There's no reason to think that he won't be able to put those numbers up again. But, it's when you're losing some of your weapons, when you're losing when you're losing that offensive line help, that offensive line that did take a downturn, but was still one of the best offensive lines in the league last year, helping you keep your pass protection clean, helping you set up those runs in those holes in the running game. It's going to hurt, and I think they definitely got worse in this offseason. It's tough to say again because this Cowboys team is still really good. right? This Cowboys team still has a lot of talent. They still have a top 10 quarterback. They still have a top 5 receiver. They still have one of the best defensive players in the league, and you could make an argument their secondary is the best. So this Cowboys team, regardless of how poor their offseason was, it's not really going to set them back too far. They're still, I believe, going to be a playoff team competing for that division with the Eagles. It's going to be an interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how they respond to this, because I think the offensive line is key. If their replacements, if Tyler Guyton is able to come in, and he doesn't have to be all pro level, right? He doesn't have to be Tyron Smith, but if he's just good, if he's great, if he's a serviceable replacement, I think that this is a good enough offseason. This is a Cowboys team that seemingly wants to get further and further away from the run game, and having Zeke there just to, eat up carries, get you a respectable amount of yards on the ground, be that goal line back that he was really good at being up in New England. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Bring back a fan favorite as well. So it's not like it was the worst offseason of all time, right? This Cowboys offseason wasn't like an F. It wasn't like they lost everybody and didn't get anything of value back. It's just a disappointing one, right? It's it's something that you expect more out of a team that every single year feels like they're so close to making a run. That it's always the Cowboys year. It's always the Cowboys year. And we're not hearing that this year because they didn't have that flashy offseason. They didn't have that great draft. They didn't have that great free agent signing, that big move that'll push them over the top. And maybe that's what they need. Maybe that's the secret sauce. Maybe they need to lay low for one season and get everything together. Maybe they can go on a run. I'm not super convinced of that. Maybe I'll be wrong and there'll be egg on my face here. But overall, this Cowboys offseason was just a little bit of a disappointment. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with not being that flashy team. But people expect a lot of the Cowboys. And when they were quiet in what was really a wild offseason, especially in free agency, they didn't sign anybody until way past that free agency window had opened up. And it wasn't a huge signing anyway. So I'm going to give this Cowboys offseason a solid C minus. It's still passing. They didn't do anything to really tank their team, so it's not like a failure of an offseason, but they didn't do anything to improve their team either, so they can't get a B kind of B or an A kind of situation. So I'm giving them a C minus here on their offseason. In the next segment, we're going to talk all about their schedule. We're going to break down all 17 games, their opponents, go over their record, whether or not they'll make the playoffs. So we'll see whether this offseason is enough to push them to that next level and make them a serious threat in the NFC. So stick around for that. We'll be right back here on Sports by GSMC Podcast Network. Welcome back to Sports by GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jeremy Lapidus. If you are just tuning in, we just finished talking about the Dallas Cowboys offseason. We broke it down. I gave them a C- for their offseason. They lost a couple pieces. They definitely got worse, in my opinion, but they didn't do anything too catastrophic. Conn Smythe was their big loss, and he's getting old. He's probably going to retire soon. They weren't going to extend him. It sucks that they weren't going to get anything back for him, but that's their big loss. So it's not the end of the world. They try to replace him in the draft with Tyler Guyton. So if he can be a serviceable replacement, it'll be a solid offseason for them. We also talked about the Stanley Cup. We talked all about the Panthers raising their the franchise's first Stanley Cup trophy after a 2-1 win in Game 7, a dramatic series full of twists and turns. And we talked about Connor McDavid winning the Conn Smythe despite losing the series. He absolutely deserved it. He was a great player, but it feels a little weird, especially in the moment. But after and before, I think it's definitely the right decision, especially for the future when we're looking back in hockey history. He absolutely deserved that Conn Smythe trophy for what he did in this playoff run. And we started off our show talking about the NBA draft. We talked about the NBA draft that takes place tomorrow. We did our first 10 mock draft. We had Alex Sarr going first overall to the Atlanta Hawks. We're going to end off our show here today, finishing up our NFL content, though, talking about the Dallas Cowboys schedule. We're going to break down game by game, going from week 1 all the way to week 18, give them a record prediction, and whether or not they're going to make the playoffs this year. But before we get into that, remember that if you would like to be an even bigger part of the show than you already are, all you need to do is go to gsmcpodcast.net. Leave a tip or donation with a message in it. That message should pop up on the bottom of the screen for you, me, and everybody else around the world to see. If you do have a burning question about sports, anything at all that you would like to ask, go and throw that in the comments, throw it in the chat. I will get to it as soon as I possibly can. I appreciate all of you guys for sticking around, talking some sports with me here on a beautiful Tuesday afternoon. But like I was saying, we are going to finish off our show today talking a little bit more about the Dallas Cowboys. We're going to talk about their schedule. The schedule came out a couple months ago, but the NFL season is coming up right around the corner. It's closer than you think, so we need to start getting prepared. We're going to go through every single schedule. We're going to start off with the Dallas Cowboys. In week 1, they have a tough matchup right off the bat. They go into Cleveland on week 1 to take on the Browns. That's not going to be an easy matchup. It's in the dog pound. That defense for the Browns is one of the best in the entire league, and I'm not sure how that offensive line is going to hold up. But the bigger question in that game, not for the Cowboys offensive line, but is for the Browns, right? The Browns, we don't know what their quarterback situation is going to look like. We don't know if Deshaun Watson is going to be healthy, if he's even going to be good if he plays, and we don't really know what the situation is on Nick Chubb either. You know, he's a big part of that offense. He looks like he'll be ready, but we have no way of knowing that right now. All that being said, I'm taking the Cowboys to start off 1-0 on this season versus the Browns, and their bye is week 7, right? So pre-bye, weeks 1 through 6, it's not the easiest schedule. It's kind of 50-50. It's not hard either. They get the Browns, the Saints, the Ravens, the Giants, the Steelers, and the Lions. So there's a couple of playoff teams in there. I mean, technically 4 of those teams were playoff teams last year. So it's not going to be an easy schedule, but this is going to be an important stretch of games because this Cowboys don't have an easy schedule. You look at it further down the line after the bye, they've got the Niners, the Eagles twice, they get the Texans, the Bengals, and the Buccaneers. You know, this is not going to be an easy schedule for a Cowboys team that, like I said, did get a little bit worse in the offseason. That being said, they start off 1-0 against the Browns. Week 2 against the Saints, that's probably going to be a game that they take pretty easy. That Cowboys defense is really, really good. They'll have a healthy secondary. They'll have Trayvon Diggs next to, they'll get him back along with Deron Bland, who set the NFL record for most pick sixes in a season last season. So against the Saints, I think they start off 2-0. Then they get the Ravens at home. They're playing the Ravens at home. It's not on the road. If it's on the road, I think it's a loss right away. Even that being said, this Ravens team is really good. They have the reigning MVP in Lamar Jackson, and the Cowboys just played two tough teams. The Saints are going to be better than we think. Derek Carr isn't going to go down easy. He's going to keep that Saints team competitive, and they just went up against a tough Browns defense in week 1. So I'm taking the Ravens to take down the Cowboys in week 3. They start off 2-1. And then we get first division game. First division game is in MetLife Stadium against the Giants. And this hurts to say as a Giants fan here, but I don't think they measure up very much against the Cowboys. So they're going to take that game and take a 3-1 start to the season. Next two games against the Steelers and the Lions. The Steelers game is very interesting because, again, they're going up against so many great defenses. The Browns, the Ravens, the Steelers, that really the entirety of that AFC North, right? That whole division has great defense, and they get 3 of them in the first 5 weeks. It's going to be wear and tear on that offense. It's going to be tough on that offensive line. So I'm taking the Steelers to take that game in week 5, or taking the Cowboys, even in a tough game up in Pittsburgh. I think that one really could go either way. That's one of those that I was kind of flip-flop. There were 2 games going through this schedule that I was flip-flopping on, and that was one of those. So I have the Cowboys taking it. It is going to be a tough one, but I do have the Cowboys taking that one in week 5, starting off the season hot, 4-1. Then they get the Lions before the bye. Again, they've gone up against all these tough defenses, and the Lions offense, I think it's just going to be a little too much for them. That defense for the Lions is much improved as well. It's a tough game, but I have the Lions taking that one in Dallas, right? So heading into the bye, the Cowboys here, I have them at 4-2. This is something they won the division last year. Something to remember about the NFC East is there has not been a repeat champion since 2003, 2004. So that's something you got to remember, and especially with this schedule, I think it's going to be really tough to break that trend because coming off of that bye directly, they have the 49ers in Santa Clara. And this 49ers team has been the bane of the Cowboys' existence. And I don't expect that to change here in week 8 as they drop a second one in a row, having their record fall to 4-3. And then we get an interesting game. And this is another game that I kind of was flip-flopping on here. It's against the Falcons. It's in Atlanta. And by week 9, I expect this Falcons team to be a Kirk Cousins-led team. This is going to be a Kirk Cousins-led Falcons team that will be competitive again. And I think with all their weapons, I think they could make a lot of noise this year in an NFC that is a little more open than the AFC. It was a lot more open than the AFC, actually. So in Atlanta, I have them dropping that 3 in a row to bring their record to an even 4-4 here as we head to their second division game against the Eagles at home. And this is going to be a big one for them to get. I think at home, they're going to be able to take this. The Eagles are a very good team. They got better. They added Saquon Barkley. They re-signed all of their guys. They kind of did what the Cowboys were trying to do this offseason, but they were able to succeed in a lot of their moves. I have the Cowboys taking this game, though, ending their schneid against the Eagles in Week 10, getting back above 500. But that's not going to last long because then they take home. Then they host the Texans, and the Texans are a team that added Stephon Diggs. This is a team that just continues to get better and better. They have C.J. Stroud coming off a great rookie season, so I have them losing to the Texans here, going back to 5-5. Chris says, "Who would have thought that in 2012 the Kirk Cousins would have a better career than both Luck and RG3?" And I think that's absolutely that's absolutely right. I grew up just outside of the Washington D.C. area, so having that 2012 draft, everyone was super excited. I grew up surrounded by Commanders, Redskins fans, and they were all on RG3. And that first year, he really was the real deal. It's unfortunate that injuries derailed his career there, but Kirk Cousins just didn't get hurt, and I think that's one of the things you can't predict in the NFL. Kirk Cousins defied all odds, right? He was that 5th round pick. It didn't make sense why they drafted both of them in the same draft, but he worked out, and it's kind of shocking there. Kirk Cousins, he's not the greatest quarterback in the league, right? But he's a guy that will elevate your team to at least a playoff level. And then if you have a good enough team around you, he might be able to take you the distance. He hasn't been able to find that team yet, which maybe the Falcons can do it here at the end of his career. Although he is coming off that Achilles tear, so I'm interested to see how he does this season. Heading into the last stretch of the season, weeks 12 to 18, they have four of their last 6 games are division games. Now, 3 of those comes against the Commanders and the Giants. So those 3 are going to be wins. Week 12 at Commanders versus the Giants. Again, sucks to say, but they're going to take both of those games, get up to 7-5 here, and then they run into the Bengals. They have a tough schedule. Again, they have to play that whole AFC North, which is really, really good. So the Bengals are going to take that one. Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase are just going to be a little bit too much for the Cowboys to handle as they fall to 7-6. Then the last 4 weeks of the season, they have a little bit of an easier stretch down the line, right? Panthers, Buccaneers, Eagles, Commanders down the stretch, and this is where, depending on how the standings are playing out right now in the NFC, this could be huge for them. If they can just be kind of hovering over 500 at this stretch, I think they can really pull away from a lot of teams because they do have a much easier schedule down the stretch. The Panthers in Carolina, that should be a win in Week 15. Week 16 against the Buccaneers, I know that's, not as easy as it might seem, but I don't think the Bucs are going to be too much of a challenge for the Cowboys. So 9-6 heading into Week 17 against the Eagles, and this could be for the division, right? This is in Philadelphia, and like I said, no one in the NFC East has repeated since 2004, and I don't expect that to change this year. I have the Eagles taking down the Cowboys here, and as we head into Week 18, the Cowboys are 9-7. So I've got them beating the Commanders in Week 18. Now, this is a game that could go either way, right? We see Week 18, especially division games, be kind of flip-floppy because if the Cowboys have already clinched a playoff spot at this point, they'll probably rest their guys, right? And then I think the Commanders will take this. But the way that the way that their schedule is right now and how tough it is, I think it's going to be it's not going to be a guarantee that they're in the playoffs at this point. So I think they'll play their starters. They could clinch a spot here in Week 18, and I have them winning that game. The Cowboys going 10-7, finishing second in the NFC East, behind the Eagles in this division. I do have them sneaking into a wild card spot. They are a playoff team. As much as I hate to say that, not a Cowboys fan, obviously, but they are a playoff team, and I think, I even though they got worse, they're 2 games worse. The 10 wins should be enough to get you into at least the 6th seed in the NFC. We'll continue our NFL coverage as the season goes as the offseason goes on. Like I said, this is the first team that we've covered. I'll post the full spreadsheet that I've got for you once we're done with all of this. But Cowboys finished 10-7 with a wild card spot. As of now, we're going to finish up the NFC East first. So tomorrow we'll go over the Eagles and then the Commanders and the Giants to finish up this week. But anyway. Thank you, everybody, so much for tuning in to today's episode of Sports by GSMC Podcast Network. I've been your host, Jeremy Lapidus. Thank you, everybody, so much for tuning in. I'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, as we talk about all the biggest stories around the world of sports. I will see you then. Bye-bye.
Let's go. It's gonna be a bad day. They're tired of shit in the